Welcome to Weekday Wisdom, the scriptural meditations of doctrine and devotion, only available for our all-access members. But today, we're giving this away to everyone. We want to share some of the exclusive content that we are releasing for doctrine and devotion. Today, we're meditating on Galatians chapter 2, verse 21, where the Apostle Paul says, "I do not nullify the grace of God. For if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose." As we've been working our way through Galatians, we see that Paul has been defending his ministry. But he defends his ministry by defending the gospel. Paul is accused of ignoring the law, of casting it aside, of ignoring God's will for his people. And Paul is not doing that. He's not ignoring the law. He is setting it in its rightful place. Paul shows us that the law convicts, but it is grace that converts. The law guides us to Christ, but grace gives us Christ. The law calls for righteousness, but it's grace that grants us Christ's righteousness. Paul is combating a perverted understanding of God's law that not only requires adherence to civil laws given to Israel as a theocracy that are no longer in force in the new covenant, but also this idea that our obedience is somehow the thing that makes us acceptable to God. So Paul champions grace. And he says, I'm not nullifying the grace of God. Paul can't deny it or despise it. He can't refuse God's grace or reject it because grace is his hope. It is his message. It's what he's come to understand. He has experienced it for himself. This is why he says, if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. The perfect demonstration of grace is meaningless if our righteousness were to come through the law. Salvation is either all of grace or it's all gone. He says if righteousness were through the law, meaning if the standard that God demands of us could be attained by our own obedience to the law, or if our standing before God, our acceptability before God was based on our own works, then Christ died for no purpose. His sacrifice was pointless. We've heard this kind of argument before from Paul. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 17, Paul argues that if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. Meaning that there are those who argue that there is no resurrection of the dead, and if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised. And so he says if Christ has not been raised, then we are of all people most to be pitied because we are still in need of redemption. The resurrection of Jesus is the completed work of his substitutionary saving work. He lived for us. He died for us. And he rose for us. No resurrection means no redemption. And so here Paul is saying that if the righteousness that makes us acceptable to God were through our own works, then Christ's substitutionary sacrifice was meaningless. His death did nothing. And that really is the point. Those who push legalism trivialize Jesus' death while boasting in their own accomplishments. But Paul's hope and your boast, our message, it's all rooted in the grace of God, demonstrated in Jesus' sacrifice. We are saved by the works of Jesus, not by our own works. We are forgiven by his death, made righteous by his life, and given victory through the resurrection. Listen every Monday through Friday to Weekday Wisdom as a source for regular devotional encouragement from doctrine and devotion.